Hello, fine people, and welcome to the McGill Hogan Show. My guest today is Professor Peter Schubert. He holds a Ph.D. in musicology from Columbia University and is currently an associate professor at the McGill University Faculty of Music. He is the author of the textbook Modal Counterpoint, Renaissance Style by Oxford University Press, 1999, and with his colleague Christoph Neidhoefer, he also co-authored Baroque Counterpoint with Prentice-Hall, 2005. Professor Schubert, welcome to the McGill Hogan Show.
Thank you, Nikhil. It's great to be here.
It's great to talk to you. Can you tell me a little bit about your musical background?
Oh, whoa. Okay. So I've started playing the classical guitar in high school.
Really? You're a guitarist?
Well, I was. I haven't played in years. But that's
cool.
How I got my start. And then I played, I played electric bass in a rock band in college. and and then during that period, I went to France and I studied with Nadia Boulanger. And I have to say that's when I gave up the guitar. And my guitar teacher in Paris was very annoyed because he said, "You can always study theory later," he said, "but you won't always have your fingers." And that was a very sobering kind of thought.
Did you ever play piano growing up or singing, choir, that kind of thing?
No, neither of those things, even though those things are both terribly important now. And I see that they're very important in the education of youth. Like these, I think everybody who studies theory has to be able to do something at the piano because the piano is how we think. So that you just triggered a whole little diatribe there.
No, I think I hope we can get more of those later.
Okay. Well,
so I'm sorry, I interrupted you. You were in France and you were studying with the great pedagogue Nadia Boulanger.
That's right. And that was hugely important, although I didn't realize why at the time, because then I went back to Columbia and I studied with a theorist, Pat Carpenter, and she was so brilliant and such a great intellect that I became very interested in the intellectual side of music analysis. And it's only much more recently that I realized that you have to be able to do stuff. You have to be able to go noodle around at the piano and figure out what could this octatonic scale, what kind of chords could I get out of it? And you have to be able to play around with stuff. And that's what Nadia Boulanger really taught, was somehow the intellectual side and the physical side.
How long did you study with her?
I think about 2.5 years.
Wow, and was it very regular?
Oh boy, it was regular. I used to have lessons at 9 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock, and I would wake up at 7, real nervous, and then I would go back to bed and wake up at 8, real nervous, and then I would go back to bed. And finally, I dragged myself to my lessons. She was such a forceful personality that it was really. It was very stressful, actually, in some ways.
Can I contrast that with the North American music educational system? Because I'm very intrigued by the way that the Paris Conservatory and its predecessor, the Neapolitan Conservatory, is kind of taught music. And did you find were you acquainted with North American music education before you went to Paris? Or is that how she taught you? Was that what your first serious study of music theory?
No, because I started in college taking music, and I had 2 years before I went. So I took a junior year abroad, it was called. So I was in college for 2 years, and then I took this junior year abroad, and then that extended into 2 junior years abroad and a little bit of summer stuff too. And so I did know the American system, and what she taught, I have to say, is not exactly the French conservatory system either. She had her own take on everything. And like, for instance, do you know who Gilad Rabinovich is? He's
yeah.
You do? Okay.
Yeah.
So he recently wrote a piece about Partimento. I know you're very interested in Partimento. And he wrote this piece about Partimento, and he interviewed me a little bit about what Nadia Boulanger taught, because apparently what she taught was the Théodore Dubois book is basically a Partimento book, and yet the word Partimento was never spoken. And she used these same materials, but I think she used them in a different way. And her idea of a good time was if you were at the organ and you would play the bass with your feet, you would play the tenor and alto with your two hands, and you would sing the soprano. So that's a very high level of skill that you have to be able to think your way through, I don't know, a Bach chorale or some kind of sonata. So she was very focused on the practical execution of ideas. And she really wasn't that interested in the ideas, frankly.
What do you mean by that?
Well, music theory in North America is very influenced by German idealism. I know you've talked to Bob Yertingen, and I know that he's the enemy of German idealism. And so I'm going to invoke him here. But I totally agree with him that there's something in the intellectual atmosphere in North America, which is beginning to change, by the way, because of various influences. But it was very abstract and intellectual and sort of Karl Dahlhaus and that kind of thing. And there was a kind of ignoring of the practical aspects. And musical thinking is not just on paper and in your head, it's with your fingers and your ears and your voice. And so that's the move that I'm trying to make now in music education and that I teach.
You know, you're really one of the key figures in the field of counterpoint instruction because you made it more historically accurate by incorporating improvisation and writing activities. Can you describe how counterpoint was taught in America or North America before you kind of innovated these pedagogical techniques?
Okay, that's absolutely a good question. I think in North America, the major influence in counterpoint teaching, well, there were two, but the big one in historical counterpoint, if you wanted to study how to do Palestrina, then you had to use Jeppesen, and Jeppesen was sort of everywhere. And even I think, used Jeppesen's book when I was in college. And it turns out this is a terrible book in many ways, and I've said so in public, and gotten some very angry replies from Danish people. So, but it's really wrong-headed. He really didn't get it. Even this is a guy who read all the treatises. He read the same treatises I read daily, and yet he somehow got a very different impression of what counterpoint teaching should be. So what it was that's different from what I do is it's very much on paper. It's got very rigid rules, not just the regular rules of counterpoint, don't write parallel fifths, stuff like that. But it's got there's a secret aesthetic behind it, which is you must never repeat anything. And I don't know where he got that.
Is that a romantic kind of philosophy?
Yes, you know what? That's very good because that's exactly what I say. I think he's a secret Wagnerian. Actually, it's not so secret. I think he's a Wagnerian, and that the idea is the endless melody. And if you have motivic repetition in a melody, then it's not endless anymore. It can be broken into little pieces. And if you look at Renaissance counterpoint, it turns out that there are some sort of endless-looking melodies, but if you study under the surface, you find that there's repetition, there's tons of repetition, and that the Renaissance aesthetic was, okay, we're going to have a lot of repetition, but we're going to hide it in various ways, but you can find it, and it's really there, and Jeppesen said, no, let's not have any. And that was a huge mistake, I think, and that's what informed counterpoint teaching in North America, and the emphasis was always, the medium was writing. You sat at a table and wrote your counterpoint exercise. I had a colleague at McGill who confessed to me once that he used to do his counterpoint homework while listening to recordings of Chopin. I mean, we can laugh now, but that's what it was. It was a crossword puzzle.
Like a mathematical
and you had to solve
solution in a way?
Yeah. It was just a puzzle, and you had to solve it. And it had nothing to do with what you hear or with sort of rhythmic elan or, vitality and invention.
What moved it in your direction? What caused it to, for now a lot of people are adopting the methods that you pioneered, and what started to move in that direction? How did you desire something different?
Well, that's also a good question. I think it was partly, I can tell you actually. I had a couple students who made comments about their instruction at McGill, and one of them said, well, we don't look at any real music. And I thought, what are we doing? We're looking at these little exercises in little jars. They're like parts of a body in formaldehyde or something. And that was one thing. And then I had another student who said, all we want is the grade, and we're not focused on the lesson for life in there. And I thought, oh my God, they don't know there's a lesson for life in here. We're not giving them what they need. So I realized that we had to give them what they needed, and that for years I had been teaching slightly another way and giving them something else that maybe they didn't really need. So that was part of it, and part of it was actually recovering Nadia Boulanger's teaching, which is go to the piano. And now all I say in my classes is go to the piano. Okay, go. And they go to the piano and they do something terribly simple, like here's a cantus firmus, sing in parallel thirds with it, just for starters, And that is really touching the music. It's tasting the music. It's hearing what it sounds like, what would happen if you did this. So
did she teach counterpoint, or did she call it counterpoint, or did the French call that harmony, or did they call it counterpoint?
That's really good, because yes, first what we studied with her, everybody had to do harmony, and you did it with the Théodore Dubois book, and so that was sort of the main thing. And when you wrote harmony, though, it was on 4 staves in 4 clefs. So you had soprano clef, alto clef, tenor clef, and bass clef, just like in the Bach chorales. And she focused very much on the individual lines. So her approach to harmony was pretty contrapuntal. But then she also used, I can't remember maybe it was also Dubois, the Counterpoint book. And the French counterpoint is such a disaster. Oh my God! So they invented, counterpoint rules that that don't have anything to do with anything historical. They just said, okay, if you have a whole note in your cantus firmus, you cannot have a 5th and a 6th above the same cantus firmus note, because those are 2 harmonies. So they contaminated their idea of counterpoint with harmony, and then they made up these insane rules. So I didn't do much counterpoint with her. And
now is she? But you also did mention earlier that she was not representative of the Paris Conservatory, or she was Theodore Dubois.
Yeah, because I didn't go to the Paris Conservatory, so I don't actually know what they used there. But I believe she was something of a renegade.
Now that leads to a very important question that I want to ask you is harmony versus counterpoint. Are they 2 different things? Are they the same thing? There's a bit of controversy there now in this century. Now a lot of young people are even saying, what is harmony even a real thing? I mean, is it all just counterpoint at the end of the day? So what's your perspective on that, Professor Schubert?
Okay, I think I can sort of answer that. I have an article in Music Theory Online where I try to untangle the beginnings of chordal thinking. So I'm not sure that what people mean by harmony is even what I mean by chordal thinking. But the idea that these 4 notes stacked up one on top of another are a thing, that starts to become something around 1600. So it depends what period you're talking about. And It depends what you mean
Well,
by
specifically,
harmony.
I guess I could refer to Roman numerals, harmonic function, Stufen theory, and
That's all. That's all much later. I mean, that's then the Renaissance. So in the Renaissance, before 1600, they were still pretty much. They knew that, of course, they knew what chords were. They wrote them every day, but they were thinking of them as the outgrowth of an interval. So if you have an interval between your soprano and your tenor, then the question was, what can you fill in the alto and the bass with? And so the process was, let's start with that. Whereas the process with chordal thinking is, let's start with the chord and see what chord can I put after and what voice leading rules do I have to obey. So I think there's really a big difference there between counterpoint and harmony. And of course they coexist constantly, but the emphasis changes, I think, it starts to change in the 17th century, but it really has changed by the beginning of the 18th century.
I have a chicken and egg question now. In composition, so which comes first, the melody or the harmonic progression?
Well, that depends who the composer is. I think, okay. So in the Renaissance, so one of the things I do is I read a lot of Renaissance treatises, notably, mostly Italian ones, but also some Spanish ones. And one thing I noticed after a while reading these treatises is that nobody in the Renaissance ever tells you how to compose a melody. I think the melodies either the melody comes from the cantus firmus, which is a liturgical pre-existing chant, or you steal it from some other composer who wrote a nice chanson.
Wow.
Or you make it up, kind of modeling on somebody else's tune. But nobody ever says, oh, you should really avoid. It's not until Matheson, I think, in the 18th century, that you get somebody who says, don't have a step up and then a skip up in the same direction, which in my textbook I call the pyramid rule. I got that from somebody, I can't remember who. But you don't put a pyramid on its head. You have the biggest intervals at the bottom. So nobody tells you in the Renaissance how to write a melody. So, and yet I think they started with the melody and looked for, what can I do with this melody? And people who were improvisers, that's what they learned. Kids, like 10-year-old kids, improvising in church, that was their job, and they had to be able to look at a tune and immediately see its implications. And so that's not so different from, here's a Lutheran chorale, what are the harmonic implications of it? That's actually a very similar thing. But I think for a contrapuntal thinker, you look at a tune and you have a million possibilities for another tune to add to it. Whereas in the harmonic world, it's a little more limited, I think.
In the age of the internet, has research and analysis of all these old treatises affected the study of musicology and music theory in the last 10, 20 years? Have you found more treatises now than you did a couple of decades ago? Do you find that it's a different field now, or you're still largely referring to the same treatises?
I have an article coming out in Music Theory Spectrum, which kind of detail the history of the discovery and the rise of interest in improvisation in the last 20 years. I just did a little survey for people who don't know what that is. And I don't think it has much to do. The reason I mention that is that a colleague in Spain alerted me to a treatise that I did not know. So things are still popping up, but I don't think it's because of the internet. I think it's because a colleague says, hey, did you know about this one? And I say, oh, yeah, good. But we're still working over the same ground, because I'm reading this. That's what I just said. I'm reading the same treatises as Jeppesen, and yet I come up with an entirely different interpretation of them. And the biggest example of that is that only recently did we figure out that the word counterpoint doesn't mean sit at a desk and compose lines. It means sing in church on a cantus firmus. Go into church and sing a canon, or go into church and sing on this liturgical chant. So the very word counterpoint.
Well, let's unpack that, Professor Schubert. So counterpoint means, contrapunto, right? That's point against point. Well, what's the deeper understanding there?
Well, first it starts it starts really early. It starts with Musica and Curiatus. It's way back in the medieval period that they started piling notes on top of each other and giving rules for how they should behave. So that's what note against note comes from. But the word in the Renaissance, in the 16th century and the 15th also, the word means, like they say, if you want to get a job in a church, you have to be able to do counterpoint. And somebody might have thought, they have to be able to write at a desk. But it doesn't mean that. It means get in there and see a piece a chant you've never seen before and sing something against it. And that's what counterpoint really was. And now that we know that, we look at the treatises and we say, look, there are all these different techniques of improvisation in the Renaissance. There's improvising against a cantus firmus, and there's improvising a canon, and there's improvising a canon against a cantus firmus, which is the most difficult thing. And there's improvising falso bordone, which is 4-part chordal music that you make up just on the spot. Everybody's looking at the chant, but 4 voices are coming out.
Professor Schubert, can you plot out the levels of mastery in Renaissance counterpoint? So you mentioned the most difficult thing is maybe a canon over a cantus firmus. If you were a beginner at counterpoint, what would you work through, and eventually how would it progress? And how long would it take? Do we know how long somebody studied counterpoint in the Renaissance?
Yeah, that's really a very tough question because I don't know. The musicologists are the people who do this. I consider myself a theorist, so make this distinction that I don't study sort of social issues like how old were the boys, for instance, and how many years did they study. I don't know that. I think that, and also when you say the most difficult and the less difficult, that's me talking. It's the most difficult for me. I have no idea what was the most difficult for them,
right?
Because I can't talk to them, and I would like to. But I think that the key element in improvisation was memory. So,
what kind of memory?
Anna Maria, the memory of many small things. So Anna Maria Buseberger has a wonderful book about the art of memory in music in the medieval period. And one of the things she said that has never left me, it's such a powerful thing, is that the kids knew their times tables up to 20. And that's a lot more memorization. Yeah. If you say 9 times 7, then I know what that is. But if you say 19 times 17, I have no idea what that is. I got to get the paper and work it out. But the kids knew it. And so they could memorize, like, how many possibilities are there? Like 400 or something. So you have to memorize 400 triplets, like 16 times 15 is this. 16 times 16 is this. So that's 400 triplets of information. And so anybody who could do that could memorize a lot of musical patterns. And for instance, so when I say improvising against a cantus firmus, improvising a canon against a cantus firmus, that's something I taught myself to do. This is with my beginning of my studies of improvisation in 1999. And it was so hard, I can't tell you. And I limited my liability by saying, okay, I'm only going to do a canon at the fourth above after a half note. So there's many possibilities. You could do a canon at the fifth above, the fifth below, after a half note, after a quarter note. So the theorist who talks about this is Lusitano. Other theorists do too, but the guy who really did the most is Lusitano. And I took the canon at the fourth above, and I had to memorize. It was like, it seems risible now, but it was only like 14 possibilities. If the cantus firmus goes down a step, then I must start on this interval above and move to this interval, and then the other guy who sings the other part will be successful. And I found this so difficult to memorize 14 stupid combinations and then be able to apply them, because the cantus firma is, okay, first it goes down a step, but then it goes up a third. Oh my God, I have to memorize that pattern. And then it goes on the same note and I have to memorize that pattern. And I have to be able to apply it flexibly.
Yeah, does each pattern have its own vocabulary of variations?
He doesn't say that. He just tells you what to do in half notes. And if you're any good at all, you'll put in some passing notes and some neighbor notes, and you'll make it musical. But he's just worried about survival.
There's so much I want to ask you. You mentioned that you read a lot of treatises. Let's talk about Zarlino. Let's talk about Artusi. For someone who doesn't know what the treatises are and who the authors are, can we say there's a best author? Can we say there's a most influential one? Are they all similar? Are there stark differences between the treatises? Can you give us an understanding of this?
Okay, well, I think the most influential is Zarlino. And when I was in graduate school, I didn't know exactly how influential, and I had a question on my comprehensive exams, which was, what did Zarlino do that was new? And I think that what they were looking for was, he said you could derive all the consonances from 6 numbers, which is of no interest to me, but it's true that that's a new thing he did. But then later, I discovered that he had some formulations of how you should write music that were very important. So, he was reprinted. Everybody knew him. Remo read him. So he was all over the place. But the most complete theorist is, I pronounce it Cerrone or Cerrone or Cerrone because he was Spanish, Pietro Cerrone. So he was he wrote the biggest book, which is 2 massive volumes. This thing is thousands of pages long. And so what he did was he stole from everybody. So his thing is like a compilation of all the best thought in about 13 or something. So there's him, and then the most informative about counterpoint, about improvised counterpoint, is Lusitano, who I've mentioned. He's Spanish. Actually, he's Portuguese, I think. And he's super interesting, and there's a new edition of his...
the Wikipedia says he's of African descent.
Yes, there's an article about him.
That is amazing.
I think it's by Stevenson, and the article is titled "The First Black Music Theorist." That's powerful stuff, and he had a very interesting career. So Philippe Congalem has a very nice biography in his edition of the large treatise, and it's good reading because the guy was he was all over the place.
Right. Counterpoint. Do you have to have a teacher? Can you read it from a book and teach yourself?
Yeah, sure. Especially if you use my book. I think you can, but you need to know a lot of music. So one of the rules for composers was you need to know counterpoint, of course, which is just the rules. The rules is like the rules of grammar, like the verb and the subject have to be in agreement, stuff like that. And that's so basic, we don't even think about it. But then after that, when you come to aesthetic issues, they said you should look at good models. And what they meant was you should steal ideas from the good composers. And you should reject what they did that you don't like. And you should keep a commonplace book. You know what a commonplace book is? It's where you write down little phrases that you hear somebody say in a store. It's a trick that they learned from the rhetoricians, supposedly, which is if you read something that you like, jot it down in your notebook, and then you can use it later. So that's what I meant before about stealing melodies. I think you were meant...
Professor Schubert, can you give good examples of, in your opinion, who are the best exemplars to copy from?
I still think that Palestrina has something to offer. So even though there are a lot of other composers out there, I think Palestrina has certain techniques that it's nice to model on. And but anything else I say is just like who I like or who I happen to like right now, because I just discovered, for instance, Willaert is so smart, it's ridiculous, and he was very celebrated in his own day. He was hugely influential. He taught other composers, and yet nobody really understands his music, and a lot of people don't like it.
Is this
and
Adrian Willaert?
Yes.
Okay, the founder of the Venetian School?
You know his, yeah, good. So, do you know his music at all?
A little bit.
It's like, to be honest, it's like, if you don't study it, it's super boring. I mean, it just rattles on. It's the same texture all the way through, and it's the same. That's not true of the motets. The motets have sometimes interesting openings, but once it gets going, it's like 4 parts, and everything's consonant, everything's nice. And and everybody looks for, a little chromaticism, this is exciting. And I'm not sure that they thought it was that exciting then. But if you look very deeply into the counterpoint, it's so smart, and you can see why he was so celebrated. And lately I'm discovering Willaert. So that's, and Rory.
He's the teacher of Zarlino as well.
Yes, that's right.
That's what a great connection.
Zarlino's, So a lot of the things that Zarlino says in his treatise, of course, you can find in Willaert's compositions. So that makes a nice example.
Josquin de Prez is one of the most famous composers in music history. Can you talk a little bit about him?
Yeah. Okay. So he's part of a movement that we think took place around 1500. And the movement was to kind of simplify the counterpoint of earlier composers like Dufay, for instance, and where the lines are very, actually they're very endless in the Yepesonian kind of way. They're very hard to take apart. They just seem to flow along, and they're all very independent, and it's very complicated and kind of dense. And Josquin and other people like him, like Mouton and so forth, came along and wrote a much simpler counterpoint. And the melodies, so this is a phrase that Jesse Roden said in a meeting once. He said, the melodies got dumber and the counterpoint got smarter. And that's such a funny phrase. Because it's true, the melodies become very simple. They're not long and flowing and elaborate like Dufay's melodies. They're just little guys who are like as long as the text phrase. The music is a little short phrase, and it's coupled with some other little short phrase, and the two of them together make a little duo. And the sopranos and the altos sing that, and then the tenor and the bass sing the same thing, but maybe the alto continues over, or maybe not even. And so we think the music became much more accessible. My colleague, Julie Cumming, has written about this, that the music becomes more accessible, and partly as an issue of patronage. So it had to be that people who maybe weren't so sophisticated, who were going to fund these projects, could understand the music. And it's true that Josquin's music is so immediately accessible. You immediately know what's going on, and it's so pleasing and simple.
Would it be a gross description to call him the Mozart of the Renaissance?
Well, now you're prying at my opinion of Mozart, which is very difficult. So maybe, I see what you mean. Yeah, you could say that. Okay.
I did say gross description.
No, because there's two big movements in music. There's kind of music for the knowledgeable listener who appreciates a really great technique. And then there's music that's just so appealing you can't resist it. And I think Josquin and Mozart do fall into the latter category. So that's not bad.
Okay, now I have a big question for you, which is, in your book, Modal Counterpoint Renaissance Style, you say, in the note to the student, you say, why would I learn Renaissance music? And then one of the reasons you give is you stand to learn a great deal that'll be useful later on. Most important, you will learn to read and evaluate a score and have a good idea what it sounds like. And it's an important question. I think a lot of music students today are seeing that a study of counterpoint, looking back in the past, can really help you just be a better musician overall. What are the reasons to perhaps dip into the Renaissance other than it just sounds great? Is there a generalization of skill that you will develop from studying this music?
Okay. So what skill would you get from it that you would need when you approach later music, and especially when you approach your own music, whatever that is? And I think the idea of layering, like that this tune has an identity and this other tune that sounds against it also has an identity, and they're both nice tunes, and I can choose to listen to one or the other. Like that's really not how harmonic thinking works, I think, where you really have the choice of who to focus on, and you learn to move things around in space. So the spatial analogy is, here's my tune, and here's this other tune. Suppose I move the other tune 2 beats later. What would happen? Suppose I move the other tune a fourth up. What would happen? What would happen if I inverted both tunes in their original combination? So there's all these possibilities that you learn to sort of as ways of thinking about music. Harmonic thinking doesn't really do that much. You don't really care so much about invertible counterpoint. You don't care about the retrograde of the melody. So there's so many things you can do with notes in counterpoint that are so interesting. And modern composers sometimes use this. Well, I happen to be a fan of Kanye West, who writes these such interesting beats. They're like so well thought out, and they're so full of variety. So variety is a Renaissance ideal, and he's doing it now with those beats. And that's one example. And then
isn't the ability to write counter melodies with freedom and fluency and speed, isn't that so important in contemporary popular music?
I think hip-hop is like filled with layers. So that's a way of thinking that is not always, you don't find that particularly in Bob Dylan. I'm sorry, as much as I like Bob Dylan. But there's another composer, there's a German composer who does layering, and I just can't think of his name. This guy, whoever he is, he will take one piece that he's composed and snip out all the wind parts and paste them on top of some new wind parts, some new string parts, and you have a new piece. And it's sort of preposterous, and I think it's really good music, and it's made in a very contrapuntal, layered kind of way. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be learned from studying Renaissance music.
You alluded to that word as a contrast, harmonic thinking. And that's been quite controversial the last 10, 20 years, especially of the younger part of mentor generation. They're kind of very skeptical. I think people have badmouthed Roman numerals and harmonic theory and kind of exploring older techniques, older Italian techniques, Renaissance, 18th century Neapolitan. Let's talk about, I'd really like to spend the last segment on music education, how you would reform it, what you are doing in the classroom, which is so different, so effective, so much fun. Let's talk about what you do in the classroom now, and how do you teach now? Like, if somebody comes to you not knowing anything, but very eager to learn, how would you work with that student?
Okay, well, that's sort of what I do actually in the classroom, is I start out, as I said before, with here's 3 notes, go to the piano, play the 3 notes, and sing in parallel thirds. Now sing in parallel thirds below. Now sing a line in contrary motion. Now do this. And it's never, it starts with performance like that, and it doesn't start with writing.
Do they sing la or do they use syllables?
Well, that's really such a good question. So don't tell my colleagues, but at McGill we teach fixed do, which is the French system. Right. And I tell them, you can do anything you want, I don't care. So I just say, sing la la, or sing solfege, or sing scale degrees if you can figure out where they are. I really don't think that matters, because I think when you're learning this, especially at the beginning, you need to know that there's an intuitive kind of feel for the material that's different from learning it in an intellectual way. And my favorite example of this is Duolingo. I love Duolingo. Do you know what that is?
Is that the language learning app?
Yeah. It's a language thing where there is zero grammar in there. So they just say, here's a sentence, wir brauchen Zahnpasta. And just say that. And it means we need toothpaste. And it doesn't say whether toothpaste is masculine or feminine or what case it's in, and it doesn't worry about this. It says, shut up and repeat it. So that's sort of my approach to music, is just shut up and do it. And as we go along, maybe you'll learn that there are genders and cases and conjugations and stuff.
Before we carry on with your curriculum, just a quick question on the solfege. What is your opinion on hexachordal solfege? The Italians might have used those overlapping hexachords of 6 notes, no 7/3. What's your opinion on that?
Well, one of my colleagues, actually, Julie Cumming, teaches it at McGill. She teaches people to move their thumb on their hand to find out the note. And she actually does it herself. And I think it's interesting and it's a useful thing. It's especially useful if you want to know where the semitones are in 2 different locations when you're doing a transposition of a melody. I think that's useful. But it's okay with me if you use octave fixed do. I don't think it's necessary for people to learn that now. I think there's something to be gained from it, but it's not high on my list, actually.
So now you've taught them to sing thirds above and below the cantus firmus. What else happens then after that?
Well, then you go in exactly as Lusitano and other theorists did. You teach species. You say, okay, here's how we use dissonance. So you can have passing dissonance at this level, and you can have neighbor dissonance at this level, and you can have suspensions that work this way, because you have to learn all those little parts of speech, kind of, So I actually start with cadences. After I do parallel things like a faux-bourdon, I would teach faux-bourdon because it's real simple. And then I would teach the cadence in 2 voices, because you need that every day, all the time. So it's so basic. And then I would teach them to improvise a canon.
Let me ask you: are canons extremely difficult? I mean, are they a step too far for a beginner?
No, it's super simple, and that's why I have these videos on YouTube. I don't know if you saw any of them.
Yes.
But I have like 14 videos on YouTube, and they show how ridiculously simple it is. All you have to do is memorize like 5 things, like stay on the same note, go down a third, go down a fifth, go up a second, go up a fourth. That's it. Those are 5 things that you can do that are guaranteed to produce a good canon. So I have them sing canons in class. The real adventure now is going to be with remote delivery and latency. Yeah. How are we going to have people sing together? I'm really nervous about this.
Right.
But no, canons are super easy.
Are canons and fugues hyped up a bit? I mean, are they actually quite accessible, is what you're saying?
I'm saying that there's a certain kind of canon, which we call stratofuga. That's a term invented by John Milsom. And that kind of thing is fantastically easy, and you find it in the music everywhere. You find it in Willaert, and you find it in Josquin, you find it in Palestrina. It's all over the place, this canon, type of canon. there are more complicated canons, and that is more out of reach. And fugue is such a big, complicated thing that it should be out of reach.
You're such a master of this area. But I know I've seen videos of you discussing Brahms and later music. Do you see parallels of what you're teaching now in Renaissance music with later eras of music?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think that I have two videos, one on contrapuntal thinking in Haydn and one on contrapuntal thinking in Brahms. I think Brahms is pretty well known for loving and using counterpoint in his pieces, even the pieces that sound very chordal, like clunk, clunk, clunk on the piano. But if you look inside, there are lines that are doing interesting things. So yes, absolutely. And the problem with...
does it give you greater insight than if you would have looked at Brahms with like a harmonic mindset?
Yes, I think you would play it differently too. And the same thing with the Haydn, that little Haydn example. I think when you know where these tunes came from, they're not just dumb little tunes anymore. They're something much more interesting, and you would play the music differently.
What doesn't work in music education? We've had a century of the 20th century, and I think America has exported a lot of its music education around the world. And the British system is very popular in Asia with ABRSM. You're a very experienced pedagogue. What doesn't work in music education?
Well, the problem with that question, I was thinking, I watched one of your videos, one of the Friday morning things, I think it's called.
Oh, that is coffee shop stuff.
No, I like it. I like the tone a lot.
I'm honored, but I don't know. I feel like you've classed it up a bit by even looking at it.
No, because you raised such an interesting question in one of them, which is there's been a loss that people don't know how to improvise. That's a loss, and I sort of agree because I like improvisation. I like teaching it. I like my students to do it for any number of reasons, but I don't see how it's going to help them get a job. So when you say what should we be doing in music education, it has to do with the whole world. Like somebody who can improvise is not going to get a job because of it, I don't think. And I talked to somebody who teaches at the Schola Cantorum in Basel, who teaches improvisation, but was wondering, like, what's the point of this? Do they play better because they improvise? It's not clear. Maybe they play better when they memorize their piece and do the old-fashioned thing that you said you thought was so antiquated. But that's how they get a job. And so I don't think we can just change the world from the classroom because these kids have to go out and survive. So is improvisation a survival skill?
That's a great question.
Really,
the way I was thinking of it is that it makes you, I guess, to borrow a term, a little anti-fragile because you are able to respond, I guess, to musical situations.
No, you're absolutely right. It's like, can I speak music? And the answer is, if you've studied improvisation, yes, you can respond to a musical thing with a musical thing. And that's huge. I think that's huge. You think it's huge. But
and also you can write music too, because I feel like a lot of graduates don't write much music, and if you've heard the same sonata a million times, it's kind of cool and it's kind of interesting to to push the culture in a direction where you're expecting more creativity out of your graduates.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and there's no harm. You will write better if you've improvised. Like when we analyze now Renaissance music, we look at the thing and we say, oh, but look, this is just a strettofuga, but look what he's done with it. He's done this terribly clever thing. Like Thomas Morley has a strettofuga, and then he has the same strettofuga at a shorter time interval of imitation. It's like a little intensification. You give things names that you know about because you've done them, and you spot them immediately in the great works. But again, I'm still worried about how the kids are going to get jobs.
Do you find, can I ask you a question just on perspective? Have you seen a change in interest in improvisation in the last 10, 20 years? And I do know in classical music, generally speaking, in the 20th century, nobody really wanted to improvise, was interested. In fact, it was seem to be quite hostile in some situations. Has that lessened in a little bit? Are people more open to improvisation?
Oh, yeah, completely, especially in the last 20 years. I mean, my area of focus is not Parlamento or 19th century, which are places where people improvised, but in the Renaissance, and it's exploded in the Renaissance in the last 20 years, and especially, I have to say, in Europe. Europe is really a little ahead of us in North America. In improvisation, there are groups there that go and give concerts of improvised music. And many groups do that, and then they teach improvisation, like at the Schola Cantorum or other places. So, yeah, this is absolutely exploded. The reason I think that the Renaissance improvisation is a little more interesting than the later stuff, the Parlamento, is that really Parlamento and 19th century improvisation, it really has to take place at the keyboard. And whereas the stuff that I'm teaching can be done by 4 people standing under a tree, and it's very much just in your body. It's not, you don't need the keyboard. I do think the keyboard is important, of course, but it's nice to be able to make real good sounding music.
Oh, I had a question about that. Okay, so temperament and tuning. What is your perspective on that? Do you want mean tone, equal temperament, just intonation? When you're dealing with this music, what is your preference?
Okay, well, I'm going to disappoint you here because I want just intelligibility. If I can tell it's a major third, that's good enough for me. I don't care which kind of major third it is. And I think all the debates about tuning are incredibly interesting, but that there's no right answer. And it's nice to hear a chord really in tune, but are you really able to tell whatever it is, the 5-cent difference between just and tempered? I really am completely happy with anything.
Right. Do you find that if somebody has, I mean, the concept of absolute and perfect pitch, I guess it doesn't really have any meaning in Renaissance music because everyone is in different temperaments. There's no standard there. But do you get students who have fixed do, absolute pitch, and then they're confused by everything?
Yeah, a few. Yes, that could happen, and especially when I conduct my chorus, if I have someone with perfect pitch, and I do. And then we say, okay, this piece is a little high. Let's sing it down a tone. This guy freaks out. He makes a big fuss, and that's actually a real problem.
Right. Perfect pitch. I mean, I've always been curious about it. It can't really. I mean, what does that mean? I mean, perfect pitch and equal temperament. But if that's the case, then your fifths and your thirds get a little compromised, and even that's not in tune and that kind of thing. So, do you have a perspective on perfect pitch?
Well, the people I've known who have had perfect pitch, some of them said, I grew up in a house with a piano that was a semitone flat, and so my concept of perfect pitch is a semitone flat. So I think these things are very variable.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of room for human experience. It really is. And I don't know. I think that many people learn perfect pitch that way from their family piano, and their family piano was probably tuned equal temperament.
Right.
So that's how they learned it.
And what do you think of equal temperament then?
I don't think there's a book. Did you read this book called Why Equal Temperament Ruins Music or something?
I've heard about it, but I haven't read it yet. But it sounds like a polemic. I'm very interested to read it.
Oh boy, yeah, it sure does. And sometimes I can hear that it doesn't sound so good because I do a lot of work with singers and choruses, and I like to hear the chord when it's really tuned nicely. But mostly I sort of think it doesn't matter too much. Because if what you're following is some complicated contrapuntal idea, then if it's a little out of tune, it doesn't make that much difference. I'm sorry, maybe I'm saying something bad, but
no.
I think it's not that big a deal to me. There's so much else. There's so much else that's interesting. Like you don't ruin Palestrina by singing him in equal temperament. Because there's so much else going on. It's so interesting.
I have 2 big questions for you. I'd like to end off on the big ones. What's the best way to learn counterpoint?
Okay, the best way to learn anything is to throw yourself into it. And if you have a book, that's nice. If you have a teacher, that's nice. If you have some scores that you love, like some piece that you just can't get enough of, you play it over and over again and you try to figure out what's going on. At some point, you need probably some help with understanding what's going on. Like, it's okay to use Duolingo, but at some point you're going to have to get a grammar book. So I think that you do need a book, but improvising is a huge help, and fooling around at the piano is the most important thing you can do. Even when you're learning counterpoint, that's going to be vocal. In order for you to experience what a major third sounds like followed by a minor sixth, you have to play it like 1 billion times. It's just the way a child learns to speak. They say the words over and over again. They get them wrong for like 6 months, and then suddenly they say them right. Like my son used to say heckapopper for helicopter, and that made perfect sense, and now he says helicopter. And you have to, the reason improvisation is so good is that there's nothing at stake. You're not going to get marked off for a parallel fifth. You just know that was wrong, do it again, and you just move on. And that's what the children fall down, and then they get up, and eventually they can walk.
Okay, and the last big question is, I tried to tease it out of you, and I have to say, you are quite a radical in the sense that you demurred on the improvisation thing, but you are really responsible for, I think, pushing the study of counterpoint in a more practical way. So I will ask again, maybe in a different way, a gentler way. Music education, what would you like to see in music education for the benefit of the students?
But you see, that's why I sort of demurred on the other one, is because what's the point? What is it they want out of their education? Like, do you want to be able to write a Renaissance motet? What the hell use is that? So I think you have to ask some much bigger questions. What does it mean to understand music? Whose music do you want to understand? I really think these opens up much broader issues, because what's the purpose of it? Like, and we don't even, we don't even know when we teach something, we don't know what use it will be put to later. Like, who's going to use this knowledge and how are they going to use it later on? So I don't want to make a record. I mean, I think it's fun. It makes you a better to improvise is fun. It makes you a better musician. It makes you think differently about music. It makes you able to identify things in the world that you probably couldn't have identified before. And so all of that is really, really useful, maybe in a more general way, and I think everybody should do it. But I can't say that you're going to get a job at the end of it. I don't know what you're going to do.
I found among my peers, I studied tonal harmony in college, and I always found it a struggle to compose and improvise because it didn't sound right. It sounded cookie cutter to me. And ever since I explored these older methods, these Italian methods, I was just amazed at how fast people could write and make music, like, very quickly. Yes. It wasn't like you lie on the couch and wait for 2 years and you come up with a sonata. It's like, it's a task, it's a craft, I can knock it out. And that's, I think, what a lot of the younger generation are really intrigued by your methods and your peers who are doing this improvisation. It's, how do you write music and make music so quickly? And how does this have something to do with the old methods? And I think that's really why we're so intrigued by this, particularly in music education.
No, I completely agree with you about fluency and speed and facility and those kinds of things. That's absolutely right. That you get a glimpse of what it might mean to write like 50 sonatas in a year or something. That's within reach now, for sure, using these methods.
Well, what can I say? I mean, the brilliant Professor Peter Schubert, I mean, he's a pioneer in the art of improvisation in counterpoint. A lot of people really admire your work and the way you have turned around the classroom from a very... Counterpoint has often been perceived as a very dry, painful, unpleasant experience, but you have completely turned it on its head and made it fun, practical, and very effective, I believe, for graduates, because graduates can walk out and they can really use this in terms of making music, and it's not like you have to pay a composer. You can compose. You learned this in college. You can improvise. You can do so many things with music. Right. And I think, Professor Schubert, I really admire your work and what you're doing. Can I ask you, do you have what projects, events, articles, do you have anything you'd like to mention coming up for the rest of the year or even in 2021?
Well, first, let me thank you. That was really a nice little encomium there. I have this article coming out in Music Theory Spectrum like next month, I think, that tells the history a little bit of research into improvisation and shows what, like, really the nitty-gritty of what it would mean to improvise against the cantus firmus using a repeating motive. So you have a cantus firmus and you have a little thing, maybe 4 half notes long, and you repeat it occasionally when you see an opportunity. So I've really dissected that. And that's all I have in mind right now.
If people want to reach out to you with questions, how can they reach you?
To email me.
Great.
Should I say my email address?
I'll put it in the show notes link. That'll be.
Do. No problem. Because people write to me about my textbook. They say, I don't understand this, or this exercise doesn't seem to do the job, or something. And so I always answer them. So that's not a problem. I would be happy to talk to anybody.
Wonderful. And the books are Modal Counterpoint, Renaissance Style, Oxford University Press, 1999, and Baroque Counterpoint, Prentice-Hall, 2005.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I just have to correct one thing. The Baroque Counterpoint book is temporarily out of print.
I noticed that. On Amazon, I couldn't order it. I tried to order it for the interview, but it's out of stock.
No, and so I think we're finding a new publisher soon, and so that will come back to life. But right now it's out of the picture. I just thought of one other thing, which is I have a couple of CDs that are commercially available of Renaissance music, and so one is called Scenes from the Gospels on the Atma label, and the other is the Magnificats of Pierre de la Rue on the Naxos label.
What are those? Can you talk about those albums really quickly?
Sure. The Scenes from the Gospels are pieces composed in the 1530s and 40s when motets started to take a much more narrative role, and they took scenes from the Gospels and really sort of made madrigals out of them, and we try to sing them in a very expressive way. And the other one is the Magnificats of Pierre de la Rue, who's a contemporary of Josquin and a very good composer, and that's I think the only place you can hear those Magnificats.
Wonderful. Well, Professor Peter Schubert...
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's it. Thank you so much. I think you did a great job. You're a really good interviewer, I have to tell you. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, Professor Schubert, seriously. I hope you come back on again because, every time I do this show, I get a little bit smarter, and I ask a little bit smarter questions with each new guest. So I hope when you come back again, I can... ask you more technical questions about your work. So,
oh boy! Well, you asked such good questions already that I'm a little nervous about more intelligent questions.
All right, Professor Schubert, thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you, Nikhil. Bye bye.